An idea of what this site is. This is a site that is historically important before it became the Forks of Cypress, because it was the land owned by the infamous Cherokee renegade chief Doublehead. Many of you have heard of that name. Doublehead earned his name because he was two-faced, or the Cherokee said he was. He had a schizophrenic face and he had a normal face. So he was known as late Bill McDonald said he was the most bloodthirsty Indian in the Shoals history. So he had killed more white men than any other Native American in this area. But when he became peaceful, in the end, he literally became a businessman. And the government gave him, for his services to the government, a reservation. And the reservation stretched all the way from Elk River in the east end of the county to Cypress Creek, from the Tennessee River 10 miles inland. That's Doublehead's reserve. So this land was once owned by the infamous Doublehead. Also, when you came in, if you took time to notice, there is an old stone chimney down there. That stone chimney is what remains of a log cabin. The log cabin was arsoned by a group of teenagers a number of years ago, and the interesting thing was the log cabin was older than this house. We think this house was finished 1820, 1821, somewhere in there. And of course, if you noticed last week, the 6th of June was the anniversary of the burning of this house. The house burned on June the 6th, 1966. So my family, she was talking about my family's connection. When the land was sold out of the Jackson family, about 1910, 1912, somewhere in there, it passed through a number of hands until the early 30s. I think it was 32 or 33, my great-grandfather purchased it. He bought the house, and he bought some of the adjoining land for $30,000 cash in a sack, in a grocery sack. I've always kind of been interested in how he got that cash in the Great Depression. Because that cash money could speak of the Great Depression. So he bought this house, and the interesting thing about the house is you'll notice its design. The Alabama Historical Commission, Robert Gamble, the chief architectural historian in Montgomery, says that this house is the first house of its kind in the Deep South. First house built, called peristyle, P-E-R-I-S-T-Y-L-E, meaning a porch completely surrounding the house, supported by a colonnade. So you're sitting on the colonnade, and the house began about 10, 12 feet behind you. So this was a brick portico that went all the way around this house. And even on a day like today, you could find shade somewhere on this porch, and you could find a breeze. No matter, just keep walking, walk around. Another thing interesting about this house is its view. James Jackson had very good taste, didn't he? Look at where this house sits. On a hill commanding the view of that view. You crossed, if you came this way, you crossed Little Cypress, and of course the old bridge is gone, but that's Big Cypress. And the two become one cypress through those woods to make the Forks of Cypress. So it becomes Cypress Creek from then on, all the way to the Tennessee River. So Little Cypress is to your left, and Big Cypress is to your right. When James Jackson came to America, he was born in Ireland in 1782. Now, the interesting thing is, he's not one of the Irish that comes to America because of the famine. He is one of the Irish that come to America for either one of two or three reasons. There was a law in England called the law, or in America, not America, but in England, the British Isles, called the law of primogeniture. And the law of primogeniture said that the oldest son inherited the estate. So if you're not the oldest son, you only get enough money to get started. So many of those younger sons and daughters came to America. They were, in this case, James Jackson was already an engineer. He was an educated civil engineer. Another story says that he and an uncle in 1798 got involved in one of the many Irish revolts against England. And if you study that period, the Irish and the English have always hated each other. And England was dominant at that time, and many of the revolts led to either arrest or execution of those involved. So some of them fled to America as criminals or as traitors labeled by the Crown of England. He comes to America in 1799 and settled first in Philadelphia, where he had a sister. And then he eventually wound up in Nashville, Tennessee. And because he was educated and because he probably had some money from his father, he began to be a businessman in Nashville on Church Street. And he had a mercantile business there called the House of Jackson, or Jackson's Merchandise. He then got involved in what became known as the real estate business, but then in those days it was called land speculation. There were so many settlers coming into the frontier, they needed land. Well, the federal government was selling land to pay war debts. We were in debt because of the American Revolution. We were in debt because of the War of 1812. And if you were a soldier from any of those wars, you could get land for the amount of service you had given the country. You got more land according to your rank, and you got more land according to how long you served. So this was called bounty land. Well, Jackson was neither of those. But he was wealthy enough to take advantage of the situation by buying up land and then selling it to settlers at a higher price. Well, he got involved with a number of men. They called themselves the Tennessee Land Company. And one of those men was Andrew Jackson. They were not related as far as we can tell, but they became friends. And another one was John Coffey. So they became involved in the land speculation business. Also, while he was in Nashville, he met a young widow named Sarah Moore McCullough. She was only 19 years old, already had a baby, and was already a widow. Her husband, Samuel McCullough, got caught up in the same law of primogeniture. His older brother inherited everything, so he married his young sweetheart. They moved from the Carolinas to Tennessee to become wealthy. And he drowned in a land buying expedition. And it left her a widow at 19. So James Jackson married her and adopted her daughter. And they would go on to have 8 of their own children, and of course he had the adopted daughter. Their first daughter was born in Nashville in 1811. So we know he was in Nashville as early as latter part of 1809, and became a businessman, and became very respected and quite wealthy. The Tennessee Land Company was officially formed in 1815, and then he got involved with a number of men from North Alabama, and they formed a company called the Cypress Land Company. It was 2 competing companies. The Tennessee Company was competing with a company called the Alabama Company. So they put their heads together and say, look, we can buy land cheaper if we're not bidding against each other. So they formed a 3rd company, dissolved the other 2, and this is the company, the Cypress Land Company, that buys up all this land from the U.S. government. This is the company that founds the city of Florence. So their purpose was to buy land, develop land to a certain extent, like develop the city of Florence, and sell lots. And James Jackson picked this piece of property for himself. We think Jackson was either the owner of or part owner in over 7,000 acres. He went in with John Coffey. His neighbor to our east was John Coffey. The coffee plantation was over on what you call Cloverdale Road. Then it was called Coffee Road. And Cox Creek Parkway divides it right through there. That was John Coffey. So when you go out here and get on the Cox Creek Parkway and turn left, you're on Coffee Lane. The Jackson's property ran through the creek. James Jackson, we're told, could get on a horse in the morning here and he could ride up either creek, ride up the Little Cypress, and then come back across and ride back down Big Cypress to his home and be gone all day and still be on his land. So he owned most everything between these two creeks, about as far as half a day's ride. Now eventually he sold lots of that property. And when this plantation was a working plantation, it was about 3,500 acres. So that's still a very considerable large piece of property. So the house was begun, we think about 1819, the latter part of 1819. And Jackson is still living in Nashville, but he comes back and forth. He has business here, he has land business here, he has business in Nashville. His family's still in Nashville. But we think that we know this, his first child was born in Lauderdale County in September of 1819. So they were living here in September of 1819. Probably living in Florence. Somebody said, well, they probably lived in that cabin. I don't think a wealthy man who had a family in Tennessee would move his entire family down here to a 2-room log house with a dirt floor. I think they probably lived in Florence somewhere and then communicate. We'd come out off and on. We don't know for sure because that log house probably was, it could have been slave quarters at one time. It could have been an office. But we do know this. It was unique because the chimney in that house was in the center and not on the ends. There were two types of log cabins built in the American frontiers. Many of them you have seen in the past where the chimney are on the ends. That is a Swedish and European introduction. They built their cabins like that in Europe. The center chimney are called the side saddle, or the saddlebag chimney, excuse me. The saddlebag chimney, that was what the Cherokee Indians were living in when the whites came into this valley. So that's why we think that was already here, probably built by some of the Cherokees who lived there while they were traveling or hunting on some of Doublehead's land. Yes, the Cherokees were living in cabins as early as 1800 or even a little earlier than that, not in what we would call teepees. So this is a very valuable piece of property. Jackson picked it for himself, and it dominates this hill. Now the house itself, we think was designed by an English-born architect named William Nichols. Now there are a number of hints. Well, number one, there is no design left. We can't find any of his drawings. But he signed, great artists always sign their work. For example, the columns are the type columns he always used. These are ionic columns, and they had scamosa tops. Now the scamosa top would come up and flare out at 4 corners, and on each corner would be a curl. That was the signature of Nichols. Also on this set of steps, one of the corners is gone, but on this corner there is that same curl carved in the stone. At the base of the staircase, where the staircase handrail came down, at the end of that was the same curl. So that was kind of a Nichols trademark. Nichols went on to design houses in Lawrence County, Alabama, around Cortland, some over in Madison County, but most of his houses that are still standing today are in Tennessee, around Murfreesboro, Franklin, that area. Another reason we think it was done by him is he was employed by the state of Alabama to design the Capitol when it was in Tuscaloosa. The old Capitol was a William Nichols design. And at the same time, James Jackson was president of the Alabama Senate, so they had to have known each other. Also, he was employed by the people of Lauderdale County to build the first Muscle Shoals Canal, which was built through here in the late 1820s. He was the engineer/architect of that canal, which later became enlarged after the Civil War. So James Jackson, we knew, was deeply involved in that canal.